Everyone, my name is Ethan Buckner. I manage Earthworks infrastructure and petrochemicals campaigns. I live in Los Angeles. I'm honored to be here at the Methane Moment Pavilion here at COP26. And we're here today to discuss, one of the great failures of the UNFCCC process has been the failure for the framework to specifically address how countries need to stop expansion of oil and gas development in order for the climate to stay within 1.5 degrees. And that addressing oil and gas development explicitly is an instrumental part of what needs to happen in order to avert climate catastrophe. And nowhere in the world is this more prevalent than in the Permian Basin, located in West Texas and southeast New Mexico of the United States, where one of the world's biggest, or the world's biggest climate bomb, and the fuse has been lit there. And today we'll be discussing the impacts of what's happening in the Permian from the hole in the ground, from the point of extraction in West Texas and southeast New Mexico, all the way to the Gulf Coast, where new petrochemical development and exports infrastructure has been continues to expand in order to facilitate further development. All the way to folks who are working to fight the import of frack gas into the EU and to other parts of the world. And we're going to talk about specifically the ways in which the export of US oil and gas is impacting the climate, is impacting this methane moment, and is impacting communities. And so just to briefly introduce our panelists before I give a little bit more background, we have with us Miguel Escoto with Earthworks, we have John Beard with the Port Arthur Community Action Network, and we have Aideen O'Doherty with Not Here, Not Anywhere in Ireland. I'll give a more complete bio before each of them speak. Again, my name is Ethan Buckner, and it's wonderful to be here with you all at the Methane Moment.
Thank you, Eve.
So, what we know, the International Energy Agency earlier this year released a scenario. How is the world going to meet a 1.5 degree limit on warming? And what we know is that science is telling us that we need no new oil and gas development, that currently more oil and gas is slated to be developed than is actually within our remaining carbon budget. And what is happening? What are the sort of the dynamics that has unleashed the climate bomb of the Permian, and that we'll discuss more here today? The first is the invention of hydraulic fracturing, the process by which oil companies drill a deep hole into shale and inject at a high pressure vast quantities of water, sand, and chemicals, and crack and fissure the shale, and then extract the oil, gas, and liquids out of the ground. And what we've seen in the United States is that after the crude export ban was lifted in 2015, the production of oil and gas out of the shale fields of the Permian has skyrocketed. Before the ban was lifted in 2015, about 4% of US oil production was able to leave the country. And as of 2020, that actually accounted for 28%. So, there's a narrative that's prevalent in the US that energy, that we need to be drilling for more and more oil and gas in order to achieve some sort of energy independence. But the reality is that is just not what's happening. And instead, communities and the climate are expected to pay the price with their health, with their risks in terms of and impacts in terms of climate disasters, in order to move fossil fuel and climate pollution to other parts of the world. Now, what does this actually look like on the ground? We have the Permian currently producing upwards of 5 million barrels per day. That's doubled pretty much in the last decade to become the largest oil field on the planet. And if there's no intervention, projections currently estimate that the Permian production could double again to 10 to 11 million barrels of liquids per day by 2030, which would represent over 25% of the U.S.'s remaining carbon budget in order to keep us within that 1.5 limit. In order to facilitate that expansion, there are dozens of new infrastructure projects that are planned and in the various stages of permitting and construction along the U.S. Gulf Coast. 9 new mega oil export facilities, and nearly 20 liquefied natural gas export facilities. And these are decisions that the Biden administration will need to make of whether or not to permit and allow for this type of expansion. So, I'm going to start to turn this over to our panelists to talk a little bit more about what do these numbers really mean, what does it look like on the ground, and why are U.S. oil and gas exports creating more of a disaster in terms of methane emissions, in terms of climate pollution, and in terms of impacts on public health and community well-being. And first, I'm going to turn it over to Miguel Escoto, the West Texas field advocate with Earthworks. He's based in the border community of El Paso and Juarez. And Miguel helps monitor oil and gas emissions from West Texas Permian oil fields. Miguel, can you tell me what this really looks like on the ground for communities impacted by oil and gas?
Sure, yeah, sure. Well, like you mentioned, the Permian Basin climate bomb was not inevitable. Two major things that happened that allowed for it to reach its potential were the invention of hydraulic fracturing and industry being able to profit off of that, and also the export piece, right? There is a vicious feedback loop of climate destruction between the Permian Basin and the Gulf and other export and import terminals, because the more production there is, the more it needs to be exported. The more export infrastructure there is, the more oil and gas can produce, right? So your question about what that means on the ground, I accompany Sharon Wilson, Earthworks senior field advocate, to do oil and gas monitoring in the field. We use our optical gas imaging camera, and we're able to detect VOC emissions, volatile organic compounds, and methane. And I'm going to go a little bit deeper into what that means in terms of the numbers and state regulatory agencies. But first, I want to talk about communities directly impacted sacrifice zones that oil and gas has created, right? As I like to say, they're impacted with their earth, water, fire, and air. Every component of their lives is being impacted by fracking. Starting with earth, we see that hydraulic fracturing and subsequent injection well processes mean that there's an increase in earthquakes, increase in seismic activity. Consistently around West Texas and southeast New Mexico, you see seismic activity throughout. It's just consistent. And you would think, well, that's not too bad. So what? There's a few cracks in my wall. Well, it becomes a water crisis, and it becomes a nuclear waste crisis, because think about all of the oil and gas wells that are scattered throughout the region. In Texas alone, there are over 400,000 oil and gas wells.
That's incredible.
It is ridiculous. In Pecos County, West Texas, there's one oil and gas well for every 2 people.
One oil and gas well for every 2 people.
That is the ratio.
Wow.
So, we have to consider that once an oil and gas well is produced, we have to take care of it for life, because if it's abandoned or not properly plugged well, it creates the danger of seeping into the water table, seeping into the water sources of the entire region, and contaminating the water, right? So you have earth, you have water, you have fire, flares. Flares are a major source of light pollution. West Texas is actually known for its dark skies. It was chosen to build a world-renowned McDonald Observatory to study the stars, right? But that is now a threat because of the amount of light pollution that there's at. And air. Air is the sky is just being polluted at extreme amounts. Like you mentioned, right now we are at 5 million barrels of oil produced and around 19 billion cubic feet of natural gas.
And that's per day.
Per day.
Yes.
Per day. So that happens with emissions and with methane releases. So when we're out in the field, when we're doing site visits with our optical gas imaging camera, we see methane emissions coming from unlit flares. We see it from flares that are malfunctioning, even though they're lit. We see it from tanks. We see it from pipeline blowdowns. And it seems like every part of the process has this dangerous methane emission, as well as VOCs. So, the community there has to live with it. This is something that, if you live in Midland, Odessa, for example, which collectively is about 400,000 people, you have more VOC emissions in these small towns than in the entirety of Houston and Dallas-Fort Worth combined. And for those that don't live in the U.S., Houston and Dallas-Fort Worth, the combined population is about 9 million people. So it is just horrible. There's cancer in the air. And a small point about all of this has to be seen through the lens of what is the regulatory agency, right? Who is regulating them? And that is the Texas state government. They have proven to be a captured agency, captured by industry. They have about 84% of flares just unpermitted. The only 3% of violations that are found result in a penalty. So oil and gas just operates with impunity. Lastly, to turn it over to the export piece of all of this, is that we're going the opposite direction, in terms of oil and gas production. How many reports do we need to read that warn humanity that we need to stop oil and gas production for us to understand the gravity of the Permian, right? You mentioned 5 million barrels of oil per day. That number is expected to double by 2030. So we're going the opposite direction, and that means that there are consequences downstream, including in the Gulf.
That's right. And there was a quote a couple years ago, as U.S. refineries, which are mostly tooled to process heavier, higher sulfur crude oil, the quote, to be exact here, is that every incremental hydrocarbon produced in the Permian Basin from this day forward, whether it's oil, liquids, or gas, needs to be exported.
Right.
And this is the orientation of the industry. This is the driver of its expansion. Mm-hmm. And John Beard, the founder director of the Port Arthur Community Action Network,
yes.
Port Arthur, Texas. John understands this industry better than most, having been worked for ExxonMobil for over 30 years and having been a community advocate for over 30 years, with experience as a city council member and a mayor pro tem in Port Arthur. John, I know your community is already overburdened with the legacy of environmental racism, and now with rising impacts of climate change from superstorms like Harvey. So you're now in the process of fighting the development of these liquefied natural gas and oil export terminals in your community.
Yes.
And can you tell me a little bit more about how this latest build-out is impacting your community in Port Arthur, and how is your community fighting back?
Well, the latest build-out has come in the form of, first of all, ExxonMobil, my former company, deciding to build Golden Pass LNG just barely within the city limits of Port Arthur on the Sabine Nature's Waterway, or the ship channel. And with them also came Cheniere Energy building up on Texas Point in Louisiana. They're so close together you can almost walk from one to the other.
Wow.
And they bring all of the infrastructure with them, the tanks, the pipelines, and all of that comes in. And now you have a third proposed facility by Sempra Energy out of California, Port Arthur LNG, that wants to come there. Now, what we have done, we haven't been in an organization like we are doing this fight, but for 3 years. But when this did come up, we got engaged in the fight against Sempra Energy. And we have filed what's called a contested case hearing suit to challenge their air quality readings and what they're saying they're going to do. And Sempra has admitted that they're going to substantially increase what's already in the air, which is going to decrease our air quality, which is some of the worst in Texas and definitely bad in Southeast Texas. Matter of fact, we're close to being non-attainment for air quality, which is going to bring in some very strict and harsh measures to get back in compliance. But SEMPA is contributing to that. So I, as part of my organization, PACAN, as well as personally, filed for a contested case hearing. And that contested case hearing request was granted, but it's also being challenged by Sempra Energy, which is now requiring me to go before the SBOA, or this administrative board, to be able to prove that I'm a person of standing, that I have some stance in this or say in the matter. Sempra's position is that I don't really have a say because I'm not affected. I'm beyond the 1 mile limit of when it's affected. But recent court cases have shown that the effects can go as far as 5 and maybe even 25 miles. Right. So you can't look at that any longer just saying, oh, he's out of range. And, you know, if you know anything about this, gas and dust and the things that come from it in the air don't respect lines or borders. They go with the wind and where the wind goes. And so where the wind goes, the contamination goes. So we have that issue to deal with in terms of that. And there's also the expansion of the processing facilities. The refineries are expanding. As you probably know, Port Arthur is home to the largest refinery in the country. And that largest refinery is now looking at building one of the largest petrochemical companies to take the fracked gas from the Permian and process it into other liquids and materials that can be used not only for gas and gasoline even, but also for plastics and so forth. So what all this has done is increased the quality of the air. It's degraded the quality of the air. And it's made it difficult for people that I know of, like a Annette Mitchell. Annette Mitchell is an 80-year-old retired school teacher who suffers from COPD. She now has to have breathing treatment several times a day and is constantly on oxygen. She can't go out in her yard anymore and work on her flower beds and do those things she used to do. Or then you have someone like Alcina Hardy, whose grandson is 6 years old, and he has to be on a nebulizer and needing breathing treatment. So you have a number of people that have been affected by the pollution previously. And now with the expansion of this industry, it's only heaping more pain and suffering upon an already impoverished and an already overburdened population.
And there was also recently a safety issue in the Port Arthur area with one of the LNG facilities.
Yes, there certainly was. It was found 2 years ago, by the way, but we only heard about it this year, that Sempra LNG in Louisiana had found some cracks in the manufacturing of the piping and also of the tanks that they hold the liquefied natural gas in. Well, you know, that can be extremely dangerous because once that gas is released and it's under pressure because it's been compressed and turned into a liquid, well, once it's in the air, it becomes a vapor. And that vapor can catch fire and explode. And all it's going to do is look for a source of ignition, and there you have it. So what you have in those 5 tanks that they're storing this gas in, millions of gallons of gas, which turn into hundreds of millions of gallons of vapor, you have the potential for something on the order of a nuclear explosion should that happen. And you have people living within less than a mile of these facilities. And if something like that happens, you can imagine what it'll do even 5 miles away. It'll be devastating. So it not only has the air quality effects, but it also creates what I call an impending danger, an imminent danger to life and health of the people that live in Port Arthur and all of Southeast Texas.
I saw a map recently that overlaid the history over the past 20 years of every hurricane that has hit the Gulf Coast, and there isn't a single pocket or region that hasn't been affected by at least one extreme weather event in the last 20 years. And what are you seeing in terms of how climate change is intensifying the risks of these types of disasters in places like Port Arthur?
You're perfectly right about that. In the last 15 years, there have been 5 major hurricanes that have come in the Port Arthur area, and potentially twice that many more in the form of lesser storms that were just as equally damaging, but they didn't get as much publicity as the Ritas and the Harveys and the Ikes and the Isabellas, I think it is, one of the other storms. But all of those storms created a lot of problems. We all know about Harvey because that left us with 60.58 inches of rain, almost 5 feet of rain in 4 days. And it devastated the city. The water was so high in some parts of town that the boats that came down the street to rescue people, the guy that was on the boat stepped off the boat onto the rooftops of houses. And then you also have, the ice storm that we had earlier this year in February. And that created a lot of problems. So we see these extremes of weather in an area that heretofore didn't have that. And it has to be associated with climate change. Whenever there's a storm in the Gulf, you have storm surge. And if it were not for the levee protection system around Port Arthur, we would be underwater from that too. So you have a multiplicity of problems that this frack gas, once it's released into the atmosphere, whether it's burned or whether, as you said earlier, just simply seeps out of the ground or out of these unkept wellheads, creates a highly damaging problem to the environment, and it is extremely damaging and affecting the lives of people.
So we're talking about this export build-out, which is causing acute health impacts, right, from the air quality issues associated with the tank farms, with the processing facilities,
right.
With these terminals. And then we're also talking about a safety issue, a hazard issue, when it comes to the intensifying impacts of climate disasters.
Right.
And now you, as someone who worked in industry for a long time, have a pretty unique perspective as an advocate for change in Port Arthur. How is your history working in the industry and now seeing how it's impacted people and coming around to advocate for a just transition? How is that part of your life's history influenced where you are now and the work that you're doing?
Well, what it does is gives me a different perspective. I've been in the plant. I've worked on the very equipment that you see that make and produce oil and gas. And I understand the processes and the safety procedures and all, because I was also but also an emergency management person who dealt with emergencies such as fires, releases, and all of that in the plant. So I understand it from a very different perspective. And I understand that there are certain protocols and safety features you can put in place, but a lot of these companies don't want to do it because they place profit ahead of people. They decide that it's going to cost us money to do this, and we don't want to spend any more money than we have to. We want to get it in, process it, get it out and sell it, and count our cash. But that's not good enough because it affects the people that work in the plant and outside. So I understand the protocols. I understand the equipment and how you have to maintain and operate that equipment. And then I also understand how the rules and regulations that the EPA and sometimes TCEQ bring out that are supposed to protect people. But quite often, they don't work because the very people causing the problem are sitting there at the table writing the rules.
Right.
And that never works. So you have to have people involved, as I am, who have been a part of all of this, to be advocates for the health, lives, and safety of people in their communities so that they are not adversely affected. And it goes back to something we like to say in this movement, breaking free from fossil fuels and all, is that the best way to solve the problem, to keep it out of the air, is to keep it in the ground. If we keep it in the ground and go back away from exporting and sending it to other countries and decrease our dependence on it to where we're going to clean, green renewables, then we can make life better in the communities that are affected where this comes to, like Port Arthur and like Matagorda Bay and Freeport and others down the Gulf Coast. We can make life better for those people. But you can't do it as long as you keep putting it in the air by pulling it out of the ground.
That's exactly right. And like Miguel, we're talking about in a panel earlier this week, that we cannot reduce methane emissions by producing more methane.
Right.
Exactly. And so now, I'm going to turn it over to our last panelist, and I'm going to introduce Aideen O'Doherty with Not Here, Not Anywhere. Aideen is a campaigner and a grassroots volunteer in Ireland, and has been working on a campaign for no fossil fuel exploration and infrastructure in Ireland and around the world. And this year, they achieved a long-time campaign goal when the Irish government banned new offshore fossil fuel licensing. Congratulations on that victory. And Not Here, Not Anywhere is currently working with allies in Ireland and around the world fighting LNG imports into Ireland and the EU. And Aideen, I want to ask you that the impacts of oil and gas exports from the Permian don't stop at the U.S. border, and you're part of this movement trying to prevent imports of frack gas. What does that campaign look like? And tell me more about the work that you're doing in Ireland.
Okay, thanks, Ethan, and thank you for the invitation to speak, because it's so important to make these links, and it's been such an important part of the campaign in Ireland and in Europe to make the links to international allies and see the impacts throughout the supply chain. So yeah, like you said, so I'm a part of Not Here, Not Anywhere, which is just one of the many grassroots groups in Ireland that have so far successfully resisted LNG terminals. So we have no LNG import terminals in Ireland yet, and we won't ever, because we're going to stop them. So we have no LNG, and that's unusual in Europe, because in Europe, in Europe and the EU and the UK, there's I think 22 LNG terminals around Europe. So the reason I think that this has happened is that the campaign has been so strong from the rural. So the LNG terminals planned for Ireland, there are 4 planned, and they're all planned for sort of small rural communities around the coast. No one's planning an LNG terminal in Dublin City or anything. So they're all planned for, small communities and similar to the sacrifice zones that you have on the other end of the supply chain. But the communities there have been so, they've conducted such a powerful campaign over the last, say, 15 years. The first LNG terminal was proposed. So you have, and I do want to name check some of the groups because there are so many and they're so great. You have groups like Safety Before LNG and Future Proof Clare and Love Leitrim and Schliella, and these are all, we're part of this great network of really, really strong campaign groups. And I think that's been a huge factor in, the fact that we have no LNG terminals yet. And I mean, the impacts, like what I'm hearing from Miguel and John are, a lot of the concerns are very similar in Ireland, at the import side of the supply chain. So initially the focus, or people were really worried about safety. So Safety Before LNG was the first group set up of the, obviously there's a similar danger when you're regasifying the LNG when you bring it into Ireland. So people were worried about explosions, about the safety of the community, and then also the habitat concerns. So, like I said, these terminals are planned in these. I mean, Ireland is, I don't know if any of you have been, it's a beautiful country, you should all visit. But, people are concerned. We have, the Shannon LNG terminal is planned for an area of special protection, special conservation with, there's a lot of, there's biodiversity and it's a, protected corridor in that sense. So those are the initial concerns, but I think the climate concern has really come to the fore in the last sort of 5 to 10 years. So I mean the LNG terminals planned for Ireland, particularly this one in County Kerry, which is on the west coast. Actually, it's a very popular tourist destination. The LNG terminal planned for there is so large, and it's undergoing the planning process at the moment. But they've managed to hold it off for the past 15 years, but it's going through planning again. The US company New Fortress Energy is very persistent, unfortunately, but so are we, luckily. But yeah, so they are the Shannon LNG terminal. I mean, they make the argument in their submission that it would only account for 2% of Ireland's carbon budget. But when you actually look at the figures, and Not Here, Not Anywhere has done some analysis on this, which you can find on our website, which you should definitely Google and check out. The analysis we have done is that it would actually account for, or the Shannon LNG terminal would actually account for up to 60% of our carbon allowance if allowed to be built. So they're planning these enormous terminals that far outweigh, they're planning on Ireland becoming an importer and then an exporter of the LNG, passing it back on through the UK, and that international, so the climate concern has really come to the fore, and I think that international element has been so important in the campaign. So across Europe, there are campaigns going on there are campaigns in Germany, in Croatia, all the same concerns about these import terminals. And the EU, to be honest, to date, has been working against us, So, for example, Shannon LNG in Ireland, it was, and it currently is still on the current PCI list, which is Projects for Common Interest. So they get priority EU funding. So there are plenty of gas projects on that list, and Shannon LNG was on that. Now it has been. Our government has said they will take it off the PCI list in the next iteration. They've requested for it to be taken off in the next iteration, but it's still valid at the moment. So I mean, our government has has been relatively engaged with the issue because they have to be, because we keep bothering them about it, and as we should. And yes, they've taken some steps to look at. They have policy statement on stopping the importation of fracked gas, but now the companies are saying, oh, well, it won't be fracked gas. We're not going to get fracked gas. But then when I hear from you guys, all the gas is fracked.
That's right.
We know that.
Exactly.
So it's, they're trying to kind of get away with it on a technicality. And yeah, like we've worked with some of your colleagues in Texas, and we've had people come over to Ireland, and that's been really powerful in kind of letting there was a terminal planned for Cork, which is again in the south of Ireland. It is a city, but and that was probably a factor for the memorandum of understanding being dropped, which it was last year. But we had campaigners from Texas come over to Cork and speak to people there, and speak to the company, the Irish company that was involved, and that was a huge factor in them dropping the memorandum of understanding. So that was going to be gas from the Permian Basin imported by next decade. So yeah, like the campaign is, we're not going anywhere, and hopefully we'll be able to continue shutting down the thought of LNG terminals in Ireland, and eventually getting them entirely banned, and hopefully that success can spread then, and we can contain the Permian bomb and put it back in.
Well, that's really incredible work, and this type of international solidarity and campaigning is so important to fight an industry that is globalized, highly globalized, and reliant on these contracts. And I know that the next decade terminal plan for Brownsville still has not been built, and partially thanks to your work. So thank you so much for everything that you do.
Well, no, thank you guys.
And I'm going to open up a question to all three of you, which is that the United States is back in. They're all in, as they've said, and the Biden administration is here in full force, positioning the U.S. As a climate leader. And yet we see the conditions on the ground worsening, and dozens of planned export pieces of infrastructure in various stages of planning and development and federal permitting. And there's deadlock in Congress around the climate legislation that the Biden administration needs to deliver on its emissions cuts. But we know there's a lot that Biden can do without Congress. And if you were to have a meeting with President Biden, the administration today, what would you say? What would you ask them to do?
Should I list the whole list or leave some for John?
You can leave some for John. You would start with the top line.
I'll leave you a little something. I'll focus on the Permian production side. Firstly, declare a climate national emergency. Right, because that's able to bypass a lot of the gridlock in Congress. Using the EPA to its fullest authority, the Environmental Integrity, the Environmental Protection Agency, which is a federal level state agency, to rein in Texas, because like I mentioned, the state government is captured by industry. So there's a lot that the federal environmental administration can do to take away this corruption on the side of the Texas state government. And I'll also add for context in terms of we're seeing the Biden administration and Obama, former president. We should always remember what allowed for the Permian to reach its fullest potential, which again was lifting the crude oil export ban. And that was under Obama's administration. We have to remember that. We have to keep that in mind when Biden is in these conversations. But I'll go back to using, the word is creatively. Use your executive authority creatively to stop production at the source. You can't regulate methane by continuing to produce it.
John?
Well, I want to say this, and before I answer that question and go a little bit further. You're right about declaring a climate emergency. He's already said it's code red, but that doesn't go far enough. That's just no different than seeing a red light or green light on the street. You know, you see it's a warning, but it still doesn't mean you're going to stop. So we need him to declare that climate emergency. But we also need to go back and look at what former President Obama did by opening this thing up and allowing the export of these, you know, gases and crude and so forth like that. That just simply took poison out of the ground in West Texas and New Mexico to export elsewhere. So to me, it's fundamentally inconsistent to sit here and want other nations to make sacrifices to make it better and make for a cleaner, safer world, but yet you're doing the very thing you're asking them not to do. You know, I think that's highly inconsistent. And it's also in some ways maybe even Machiavellian evil, because quite simply, they're doing it for money. They're putting profit ahead of people. And that's simply not good, because we can't sacrifice people. All we have is each other. So in addition to that climate emergency, he's got to stop the petrochem build out, so he can't keep sending this gas to other places, to Ireland and Indonesia and other countries. Because all we're doing is exporting poison, and we're exporting death to these nations. So that's another step that he has to take in doing that. And then on top of that, finally, he's got to usher in clean green age of fuel. So where we have renewables, we use solar and wind and others to do it, except for nuclear. We don't need nuclear either, because that's something that'll be here long before all of us are gone, after we're gone. But those are the things he can do with the stroke of his pen. And he's failed to do it so far. So how can you talk about being a leader when you're at the back of the room trying to get others to make the sacrifice? That doesn't work. You got to be up front to lead.
Right, and we know that there's a provision in the legislation that lifted the crude oil export ban in 2015, that under a national emergency declaration, the president does have the authority to temporarily reinstate the ban. Now, we know that ultimately we'll need a bigger shift in Congress. We need to strengthen our environmental laws so that we can hold oil and gas accountable. But we do know, and there's a really great legal paper that helps to outline this, that the Biden administration does have authority if it chooses to use it. To essentially, reinstate the crude export ban, which would be the biggest single action to reduce emissions from the United States that the president could take right now. And so I don't know if you have anything to add to this, Aideen, would be curious what you have to say as well. Yeah,
absolutely. So I guess, he would get the same pitch that I give to everyone I meet in the pub or whatever, which is we need to ban new fossil fuel exploration and infrastructure. And obviously the US is pretty behind when it comes to that. So I guess, what I would say to him is probably, and I would say this to I'd say this to our Taoiseach, which is our Prime Minister as well, think about the people who are affected by this. Because you really see that at COP, that we don't see, it's a lot of numbers, and it's a lot of acronyms, and it's a lot of, you get the feeling that these world leaders and even the negotiators are so they're so far removed from the reality of the impact on people's lives. So I would try and get them to or get him to think about that. And because that's what people care about, things when it affects them. And Biden is partly Irish, like every American president is partly Irish. So I probably know his cousin or something. So it shouldn't be too hard. It shouldn't be too hard to sort of to make him realize the impact of his policies and all world leaders or governments' policies on people's lives.
Well, all I'll say is if they want to find out what climate change looks like and how that climate bomb is actually operating, come to Port Arthur, Texas. You can see it firsthand, and you can talk to the people, and you can ask them about their health and how it's affected them, the air quality. You can not only see it, but you can feel it and taste it. I've had a number of people, and they go there and, what's that smell? We like to say it's a smell of money, but it's not. It's a smell of death.
It's a smell of environmental racism. That's really
right, most definitely environmental racism, because being a community of color in Port Arthur, those are the people that are mostly affected along the fence line. That's where they live. And they don't live there because they choose to. They live there simply because it's the cheapest and most affordable place to live. And they don't work in the plants or in other industries where they can make the kind of money, so they can't afford to move. So they're stuck. And they're stuck for generations in those same places. And that has to end. That hopefully with the new fossil-free age, we'll be able to have some equity and some fairness in terms of the jobs and opportunities, and create a situation where your country no longer has to be burdened by having that. And why not, instead of exporting the gas, export the technology to free you all, like we want to be free, and like we say it here, from fossil fuels.
Yeah. One thing I'll add to this, and it's something I didn't mention: stop new projects. It's so simple. Like, and the Biden administration loves to claim that, you know, there's congressional gridlock. There's Joe Manchin, so the most powerful person in the free world has no power. But going back to that, he does have another piece of authority, which is federal lands. He can stop all new leases of drilling in federal lands. And that accounts for a pretty significant portion of oil and gas production in the United States. It's about 8%. So 8% of oil and gas production in the US accounts to more production than entire countries in other parts of the world. So that's another piece that I want to add that I can't slip by, that Biden can do.
Excellent. Now we have just a few more minutes left, and thank you all for sharing your insights and stories with us. For those who are watching back at home, here at COP, what are some action steps? How can people get involved in the effort to fight the Permian climate bomb?
Well, that is a multi-layered question. A lot of things. There's no one perfect answer. But one thing, if folks are interested in learning more about this phenomena, the Permian climate bomb, you can go to www.permianclimatebomb.org. You'll find a multimedia report and website that has videos, infographics, text, research that walks you through understanding this climate bomb. It's going to be updated throughout the coming months, so that's something to keep track of. There's also going to be specific action items that you can take, like pressuring Biden to do everything within his authority. Apart from that, organize with your community.
Thanks, Miguel. John?
I think part of that organization piece, though, is they've just got to be educated on the issues.
Yep.
There are a lot of false narratives going around out there talking about how this is good and what it is, and people buy into it. You know, we were watching the Obama speech, and at the end, when he finished, everybody got up and applauded just so roundly. But once again, the same guy you're applauding is the same guy that's opened up this floodgate for this poison to be exported. So what we have to do is get people educated with the facts and the information, from the people who use it, to the people that work in the oil fields and in the refineries. That it's not about really simply trying to kill your job, but it's trying to live a better way and a safer way for everyone. It doesn't profit us if they make money and the rest of the people starve. So they need to be educated on the issues, learn about frack gas and what it can do, and learn that there's a better way. And then get involved in your community, or do like I did, start your own nonprofit organization to try to educate and help people do that and get involved.
Yep.
And I appreciate the work we've done with Earthworks to try to do that and help spread that message and get more people to understand these things so that we can have a cleaner, greener, and safer world.
Gosh, I barely need to add to that because that was so good. But no, very quickly, all the obvious things like find us on socials and go to nothere.notanywhere.com. But one thing I did want to draw attention to is some Irish campaigners are working on getting the UN to declare a global ban on fracking. And I think that's something that, you know, as a community, we can all sort of work together, because Ireland banned fracking a few years ago, again due to like really intensive and hardworking community organisers. So you know, it's incredibly hypocritical that we're proposing to import fracked gas from other countries. And yeah, I think that's something that everyone can kind of get behind. And you can find I think it's called UN Global Ban on Fracking on Twitter, and obviously follow us as well.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Aideen. Thank you, John.
Thanks.
Thank you, Miguel. Thank you all for watching and tuning in. Again, check out www.permianclimatebomb.org to learn more how to get involved, and together we can defuse the Permian climate bomb. and end the era of fossil fuels.